Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Today I'm going to be giving a little commentary on an article I was just reading that's stating that the Internet for All initiative is not likely to achieve its goals. I have some opinions on that. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So I was looking at this article. It's in Harvard Business Review. So this, in my opinion, goes to show you that something coming out of Harvard or posted on Harvard does not necessarily have to be smart, because I had some real problems with this article. I was just going to go through some things here. So it says here how Biden's Internet for All initiative can actually fulfill its mission. Let me close this little annoying thing here again. There we go. All right. So right now, close to half the U.S. population is not using the internet at broadband speeds, either because broadband internet infrastructure does not reach them, they can't afford the service, or they don't have the skills or knowledge to use it. Given how the pandemic has made high-speed internet access an essential utility, this ought to be unacceptable in the birthplace of the internet. Well, yeah, and I think everybody agrees it is. So I think that's true. So as part of our research initiative at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, that's where this professor is, he says, our study finds that a 1% increase in broadband access across the U.S. is associated with a reduction in COVID-19 mortality of 0.1% per 100,000 people, all other key explanatory factors being held constant. And I didn't look at this research. I have a hard time believing that they were able to hold all the other factors constant. I don't know how they would do that. So this would be saying like 100 people out of 100,000, the mortality rate would have been would be 100 people less. But again, with COVID and COVID factors were age. So I could certainly see that older people are not using the internet as much. They could still have access to it. A lot of it was about health and specifically weight. Those were the biggest factors with COVID. And it could be people in a lot of times people in more low-income areas don't eat the best. They don't have access to personal trainers, so there could be those things, but that's more related to their lifestyle than it is to, let's say, the internet, and they're less likely to have internet, right? So I don't know how they would have held all these things constant. So I'm not buying this, but certainly we did find out from the pandemic that, as people had to transition from working in the office to working at home and school in the schoolhouse to school at home, that was an issue. Now, one thing, it talks about urban internet here in a minute, and I'll go through that, but one thing I'm not certain about is how many people who are in urban areas would use a wired broadband connection if they didn't have to. Certainly, again, when people had to go home and work from home, that was one thing, but I know a lot of younger people who live in urban areas, and others, frankly, that are in urban areas oftentimes rely on their cell phone for broadband. They don't necessarily feel like they need a broadband connection at home. So as far as wired connections. So they'll do stuff on their phone all day long on their devices. They're not necessarily sitting in front of a computer or a laptop doing something. I think that's just kind of how I feel about that. So a lot of times, just because there's not adoption in an urban area doesn't mean that it's because people can't afford it. It may be that they don't want to pay the extra for it. Maybe it is more expensive they want to pay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't afford it. They might get it if they felt like they needed it. So it says here, in response to this problem, the Biden administration has launched the Internet for All initiative. And most of that is related to, obviously, the Infrastructure Act and the money there. But there's also just this initiative to get more people on broadband. And that may be which may well be the boldest digital inclusion project in history, and aspires to close an essential gap in the world's most valuable and second most evolved digital economy. There's a link there, and I looked that up. The second most evolved, the first most evolved digital economy apparently was Singapore, I think. So we're second. The funding for, and that's, I think, based on their analysis. So again, I didn't look at that in detail. The funding for the initiative draws from an unprecedented $65 billion sum from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, earmarked for the purpose of closing the digital divide. Unfortunately, despite its laudable intentions, the initiative will likely not be able to achieve its goals as it's currently conceived. The program, as designed, could lead to a misallocation of resources as well as inefficiencies and gaps in coordination and implementation. Right now, there are three main challenges. The funding prioritizes covering miles over covering people. It lacks a national strategy and coordination framework, and many execution roadblocks will get in the way. fortunately, each can be overcome. So it talks about this prioritizing miles over people. So again, 42.45 billion is in the BEAD program. And it mentions the two categories that would be unserved and underserved. So unserved would be anybody who is 25 by 3 or less, or maybe it's less than 25 by 3, but in that range. And then underserved would be 100 by 20 or less. So those are those two categories, and it says the program's top priority is unserved, whose needs must all be met before the money gets to the underserved. Well, that to me makes perfect sense. I think you'd want to be focusing your resources and everything on the people that have the slowest internet first, and they've got the two categories. And then once those are all covered, then you go to the 100 by 20. But the goal at the end of all of this is that everybody would have 100 by 20. It's just that, let's start with the 25 by 3. And that's the way the program is structured. It says, we analyze the initiative's investment principles and their potential impact and found that this approach is flawed. It de facto prioritizes filling big gaps in broadband infrastructure over connecting a larger number of people. To be clear, both need attention, but as unserved locations tend to be communities in sparsely populated rural areas, meeting their needs would come at the expense of serving the needs of those in densely populated urban communities who live in proximity to the available infrastructure, but lack access to affordable broadband and sufficient education about its benefits. Well, I vehemently disagree with this. You got to get everybody connected first. So, you have people, what he's saying here is you got people in urban areas that can connect to the internet. They have broadband right there that they can get access to, but then you've got people who don't have it. So it's no amount of education and affordability is going to help somebody if they can't connect to the internet. You've got to connect everybody first. That's job one. So this makes no sense. In terms of people affected, it is wider in urban areas. 3 times as many urban households, 13.9 million, as rural households live without a broadband subscription. And again, some of that may be just demographics. Younger people may be living in urban areas that using their phones. So they do have internet access, but they're doing everything on their phone. But of course, there are also low-income areas that are at issue as well. Also, I had noted that while 65 billion is a large sum, it will still be short of what is actually needed to close all the gaps. We don't know that yet. If the money is disproportionately allocated to building out infrastructure covering many miles in sparsely populated areas with expensive fiber optics, as preferred by the NTIA, it severely reduces the budget for subsidizing the existing service in urban areas to improve affordability to a greater number of the broadband excluded. This makes no sense. What they're saying is, let the people in the rural areas not have internet until we can make it affordable for these people that already have access to internet. That makes no sense. Overall, we find that approximately 73% of the funding is likely to be aimed at increasing accessibility by building out infrastructure in rural areas, while only around 21% will address the affordability challenge, mostly in urban areas. That makes sense. You've got to get everybody on the internet first before you address affordability. One of the goals of the internet for all was to close the gaps for communities of color. Unfortunately, the racial injustice associated with this potential misallocation are also significant. Our analysis finds that in the 10 largest cities in the U.S., lower-income majority non-white zip codes would generally be assigned lower priority because they would be classified as underserved, not unserved. So what he's saying there is, in some of these urban areas, they're underserved, meaning that they have access to actually pretty good broadband. I mean, it's over 25 by 3. It's under 100 by 20, but it's over 25 by 3. So they have access. I mean, maybe they can't do all kinds of streaming of things and this and that, but they have better access than certainly people that have 25 by 3 and people that have less than that. There are still people out there that are not getting 25 by 3. Those are the unserved areas, and we need to address those first. And he doesn't mention the fact that in a lot of these rural areas, it's not like all these rural areas are white. I mean, there's lots of minorities that live in these rural areas as well that, could be not having access to internet. So he doesn't mention that at all. It's approximately 16.5 million to 6.4 million Americans who cannot reasonably afford the cheapest internet-only plan in their zip code or black. Many of these people are poised to be left behind. Again, this could be a situation in a rural area as well. There are poor white people in rural areas. There are poor black people in rural areas. So it's not just an urban situation. Missing national strategy and coordination framework. The Internet for All initiative acknowledges an essential duality. There's a national responsibility to close the digital divide, but doing so requires logically developed solutions. This is because the underlying cause of the divide, the communities affected, the terrain in question, and even the social equity issues all vary dramatically from region to region, absolutely. And something he says here later, he doesn't seem to understand this. Allocating the federal money relies on proposals that draw upon inputs from state, tribal, and local governments. While this federalist approach is critical to the success of the initiative, it also promises to be fragmented, contentious, and inefficient. He talks about fragmentation here. For example, local bodies are free to establish their own definitions of eligible areas, populations, and broadband speeds, along with mutually inconsistent statements of objectives and metrics for monitoring and evaluating outcomes. Moreover, when it comes to affordability, states can pursue vastly different cures, and that's precisely because of what he said here, because of all of these differences underlying cause of the divide. Communities affected, terrain in question, social equity issues, all vary dramatically, which is why the states, the NTIA, the federal government has decided let's leave a lot of that up to the states. Talks about disputes here. Disagreements about what qualifies as low cost have already emerged. In some situations, the disputes will lead to legal challenges. For example, the BEAD program opens a door to funding municipal broadband networks, which could set up conflicts in at least 17 states with laws that prohibit treating broadband as a public utility. I'm not sure of the point there because, yes, those laws are in place, but if any state wants to take money, they cannot eliminate or say that a municipality cannot get that money. So it's most likely that states that have these laws are going to ignore them or get them off of the books because every state and territory has raised their hand and said, yes, we want to participate. Inefficiencies. The federalist approach to solving the digital divide could give rise to inefficiencies and diseconomies. Indeed, according to an analysis from the Government Accountability Office, the current approach with more than 100 different funding programs overseen by 15 separate agencies is likely to result in suboptimal use of resources. That's true, and I did a broadcast about that report, but that's trying to be addressed because the three biggest that are offering broadband money, which would be USDA, FCC, and the NTIA, now have an agreement in place that they're going to work together, and the BEAD program is all being handled through the NTIA. And there are also a lot of these other programs. Everybody's kind of going through the NTIA as being the one point of contact for the IIJA stuff. So they're trying to address these things. So he's bringing them up. He's bringing up lots of things that are issues that are trying to be addressed with this new program. So it's like he's going back in the past saying these are all issues, but I think everybody knew this, and we're trying to correct that with this new program. Execution roadblocks. For one, accurate maps, broadband coverage are hard to come by. Again, trying to address that. We know this. This is a duh kind of thing. Even in areas where reliable maps exist, the maps may suffer from a Swiss cheese problem that could make the information hard to act on. Unserved areas are interspersed with those that are underserved or served, which would make it practically impossible to prepare infrastructure build-out proposals targeting only the unserved locations. That's not true, actually, because of the fact that they are addressing the map situation. And while this is making it take longer, I mean, that's part of the pain is that this is taking a long time because we have to get better maps. There was the whole process of the FCC getting funding so that they could get the new maps in place. Then they got the funding. Then they had to wait because there was a provision in there that if there were any challenges to the vendor that they picked for the broadband fabric, then that had to go through that process, so that delayed things. We finally have the production broadband fabric in place. ISPs are now uploading their coverage data in that. The broadband maps, the first maps will be out in November, and then the challenge process will start. So that's why we're looking at sometime spring to mid next year before dollars start to flow from this. But they're taking their time on this precisely because of this problem. So we're not going to be allocating most of the funds related to BEAD until we have the maps and we know where the unserved locations are. Finally, once proposal is funded, the state must contend with a shortage of technicians to install and place fiber. Ironically, these gaps could be the greatest in the states with the greatest needs. I'm not sure of the point there. We all know this, that we've got supply chain issues and we've got people issues right now. And, states and the federal government are trying to do what they can, and people like the Fiber Broadband Association trying to do what they can to get more people trained up. So this is something we all know, and this is indeed a challenge, and this is indeed a roadblock that's trying to be overcome here. There are federal roadblocks too, because the NTIA must prioritize proposals that meet certain conditions, such as conforming to a Buy American requirement, and this is a known issue that several people have said, hey, this is going to be a real problem if we need to stick to this right now. So that's as required by Congress, or to public-private partnerships, if the relevant partners may be hard to find. Well, there's not a requirement for a public-private partnership. There might be something in there, I can't recall, that maybe something might be scored higher if there was a public-private partnership versus, let's say, an independent operator out on their own or something like that. I don't recall that, but it might be. It could limit the number of competitive, feasible proposals, but again, I don't think that's a requirement, so I don't see that being an issue. Then what can be done? Establish a framework to facilitate the best choices between covering miles and covering people. Again, it's not miles or people, it's people, period. Okay, they're trying to say cover the most number of people, take the dollars in a way that you're going to cover the most number of people, rather than trying to cover the most miles because you're going to leave out more people. They're assuming from the start that there are going to be people left out, and we might as well leave out a fewer number of people in rural locations than a larger number of people in urban locations. But you're not really leaving those people out because, as he's already said, those people, a lot of them are in underserved areas. I mean, they already have access to what today's definition of broadband is. They're over 25 by 3. They've got at least 100 by 20. So you're not leaving them out. They actually primarily have access. The question is maybe affordability. That's a whole different question. So it says strike the ideal balance between funding infrastructure build-outs and ensuring affordability. But again, infrastructure build-outs is job one. You have to get everybody access to broadband before you start thinking about, affordability. I mean, there's already affordability and stuff in here. I mean, it's before you start saying, okay, we have to make it more affordable for these people before we can run a line to this person's home. That doesn't make any sense. Develop a national strategy for goals, performance measures, and milestones. Obviously, again, they're trying to focus a lot of this through the NTIA. So there is this national strategy, in a sense. There's this Internet for All initiative. That's the strategy. And the Biden administration is very particular in the things that they're focused on. And in their case, digital equity is important to this administration. Affordability is important. Obviously, deployment. Now, deployment is last in the acronym. I don't think that's because that's the last thing you should do. I think it's because it doesn't roll off your tongue like BEAD. A B and a D together does not roll off the tongue. But it's broadband, equity, access, and deployment. I mean, these are all the things that this is supposed to cover. Bring key stakeholders together. This is a very important part of the proposals that states need to be, when they submit their applications or their proposals, a 5-year plan. They need to be very specific on how they engaged all of the stakeholders in their area. So this is all being taken care of. Again, this is a recommendation they're making that's already in place. Organize capacity building. Need to organize training in many areas, ranging from economic feasibility analysis to engineering and to outcome evaluation. It's a lot about training in here. Anyway, and what he's saying here in some of this recommendation is we need to be more federal about this and handle things, don't go so much through the states. But my response would be, how's that working for you? Because we've tried that for years and years, right? We've had several broadband programs that have all been managed at the federal level. States were not involved, and money went from the federal level to the service providers. And that's not worked that well, which is the whole reason that these most recent programs like ARPA and BEAD, IIJA is going through the states first, who know the lay of the land, who know better where broadband is needed, who know better what the challenges are. That's why that's being done. It doesn't make sense to do it at the federal level, but somehow that's kind of what he's saying should be done here. And as far as, how is this money going to be allocated, and will you be leaving out low-income areas to focus on all of these, far-flung areas? Well, let's just look at the text this is from the BEAD NOFO. So again, the goal is to cover everybody in the United States where they'll have at least 100 by 20. It says here, complete coverage of unserved locations and underserved locations, followed by prioritization of eligible CAI. So that's community anchor institutions. So the priorities are unserved, then underserved, and then the community anchor institutions. So I'll read through this. So the eligible entity is in awarding subgrants, and that's the state. So the state, in awarding subgrants for the deployment of a broadband network, shall award funding in a manner that ensures the deployment of service to all unserved locations, that's locations that are less than 25 by 3, within the state's jurisdiction. if the state has sufficient funds to ensure deployment of service to all underserved locations within its jurisdiction, it must ensure such deployment as well. If the eligible entity lacks sufficient funds to ensure deployment of service to all underserved locations, it must commit the remainder of its BEAD funds to ensure deployment to underserved locations. States must submit initial proposals and final proposals that will result in coverage for all unserved locations and, to the extent funds are available, all underserved locations. So it is saying here that it's possible that they can only get the unserved locations. But again, that's really what you want to do. I mean, if somebody's got 100 by 20 and somebody else that has less than 25 by 3, you don't want to be focusing on the folks that have got better broadband already. The Assistant Secretary will only approve an initial proposal or final proposal that includes a plan to ensure deployment of broadband to all unserved and underserved locations within the state or territory, or that provides a strong showing that the state is financially incapable of ensuring universal coverage of all unserved and underserved locations. So what they're trying to get here again is everybody to get at least 100 by 20 as their broadband service at that. And then it says here, to the extent that a state demonstrates that there are insufficient funds available to fund deployment to all unserved, underserved, or eligible community anchor institution locations, the state must prioritize projects within each of those categories based on a strong preference for projects in high poverty areas or persistent poverty counties. So they're saying here, if you don't have enough money for all of these, then you need to prioritize the low-income areas. So that's already in there. And the other thing about affordability is, he's talking about, people can't afford the service. Well, there's the Affordable Connectivity Program, the ACP, that offers a $30 subsidy. And then as part of Biden's infrastructure, Internet for All initiative, he's gotten with lots of internet service providers that have said, yeah, we will provide a low-cost option that is at $30. So that means that there are a lot of people that could get a free internet account if there's a $30 account out there, if they combine the ACP with that $30 program. And if somebody takes money, so if a service provider is going to take money, they have to provide a low-cost option. Now, it's up to the state to decide what that is. It doesn't have to be 30. It's up to the state to decide, and then the NTI gets involved and says, yeah, that's acceptable. It's up to the state to decide what a low-cost program is. Plus, you got the ACP on top of that. So there is a lot about affordability, or with these subsidies in there as well. And then again, they're trying to drive competition in some ways, maybe through open access networks and other things to maybe bring the price down. There's a lot in this article that I just think I don't think he really knew what he was talking about, because he was taking old problems and applying them to this new program where we're trying to address those problems and we're aware of them already. And again, I think we need to get everybody access to broadband, and then affordability comes next. And even if you make it affordable, that doesn't mean everybody's going to take it, because they may be just fine. I don't want to pay $30 for internet at home because I've got my cell phone package. I'm fine with that. Then if they find out that they need internet at home, then they can get it. Now, one other thing I forgot to mention is that ACP money may eventually run out. It will eventually run out, probably within like 2 or so years. I think there's like 11, 12 million people on there, and with the amount of money that there is, I was kind of calculating it would be just a couple of years that money lasts. So Congress will have to come back out if they want to maintain that. Unfortunately, I hate entitlement programs because they just start and never end, and you build them on top of each other, and then they just get really ugly. But Congress is going to have to probably vote to keep that going in a year or two, and to say, okay, we're going to fund it again, and that's going to be something that they're continually going to have to fund moving forward. If they don't, then the $30 subsidy will go away, but there will still be the low-cost option that anybody who takes this money will have to offer. So thanks for joining me and listening to my opinions today. Give it a like if you thought this was interesting. If you have any comments, leave them on YouTube chat, and I'll respond to you on that. And if you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button and click the bell to be notified when I'm live. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.